Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are today, listening to us. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you on behalf of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a distinguished, stellar panel today discussing Afghanistan and the region, 1 year after the fall of Kabul. I'm also particularly delighted that we're welcoming a panel of scholars that are all women scholars and experts. So it's a distinct honor for me. Afghanistan has been popping on our headlines, news headlines on and off over the last few years. Particularly, it made a lot of news globally as the Western military withdrawal precipitated with a state collapse in Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban, and those horrific scenes of people clinging onto military planes as the Western military withdrew from, led by the United States. But what has been the challenge for those of us at the expert community is to engage with Afghanistan in a way that it remains central to policy thinking in the West, and that Western thinking benefits not from a Western-centered lens, but also from the region and the expertise that can inform decision-making, not just on Afghanistan, but also on South Asia and Central Asia, and how that dynamic is playing out. So I have the honor to welcome today 4 distinguished experts, Dr. Nilofar Sakhi, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, Fatemeh Aman, a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, Dr. Shubha Prasad, assistant professor at the European University Institute, and Dr. Neha Ansari, an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. My name is Hamid Hakimi, and I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. So this conversation is aimed at unpacking some of those very central questions on Afghanistan as we look back on the 1 year of the Taliban at the helm in power in the country. But also as we look back and see that unfortunately much of the Western action led by the United States in particular has not produced the results in terms of influencing the Taliban behavior or moderating their behavior. The conversation about whether there is a Taliban 2.0 and whether there is a moderate Taliban versus a non-moderate Taliban, how do we engage in a way that the moderates are more upper-handed? All of these conversations seems to be, at best, stagnant, at worst, looks like there is a degeneration of our understanding of the Taliban. I'm going to stop talking too much, so I'm very happy to hand over to the panel and ask questions. Maybe I can start with you, Dr. Nilofar Sakhi. How do you assess the Taliban's rule and their ability to put together a governance structure as we look back in at the year?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hakimi, for having me here, and for the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council for organizing this event, which is, of course, timely and intend to address some of the major challenges that the last 1 year of Taliban takeover had or no. There are different analyses around in terms of Taliban's capability, attitude, policies, and behavior from last 1 year. What I actually analyze based on the behavior of the Taliban from last 1 year regarding the governance and security, and also from the some data and facts that we have from the ground and the media reports, and also people try to express their concerns and their experiences from Taliban takeover, is not really positive. The last 1 year, Taliban had plenty of time to prove that they have changed, or to just actually prove that there is Taliban 2.0, which seems that there is not. Taliban having changed based on the operations that they have in the governance, based on their ties with the transnational terrorist groups, and based on their policies and behavior towards women and girls in Afghanistan. So at least if we just bring all these three issues under closer lens, it gives us a lot of hints and direction if Taliban have changed or not. In terms of the governance, there were attempts, Taliban did attempt to develop and create an administration, which is acting interim administration at the moment. But again, the formation, the composition of the administration that they put in place was very problematic and challenging from day one. It excluded the other ethnic groups from the position of power. It excluded women, and it just brought all the hardliners and the hardcore of the Taliban that they used to be with them in 90s. The composition also gives us a direction about their policies towards minorities and ethnicities, other ethnicities, which hasn't been really positive since last 1 year. There has been a number of attempts that Taliban have taken in order to silence the factions of society, especially the Tajiks from the northern areas of Afghanistan. And there has been detention, torture, killing of that particular ethnic group if they of course resisted. So those attempts has been taken. There's by the Taliban. On the Hazara community, if we see, yes, there has been a number of attacks by ISKP, but Taliban have failed to protect those population from those attacks. And that's, I mean, that gives us hints. And of course, overall, for the other minorities as well, for the other religious as well. In terms of women's right, which they promised during the negotiation processes that, well, the word says they promise. I don't buy that argument because they actually did not promise. They said, according to their statement, they said that everything will be according, the women rights will be treated according to Islamic values. And they did not clarify what that Islamic values mean during the negotiation processes from 2019, at least 2021. So there has been extremely hard policies and restrictions on women's right to work, education, political participation. They closed and dissolved the Women Ministry. They dissolved the Independent Human Rights Commission. They dissolved the local setups and organization who used to work for the women legal issues. And they also, because of the fear and frustration that they caused around detention of women protesters and women journalists, many women organizations from around the country closed their offices. The extreme stand was against the girls' secondary education, which is banned. So, and of course, there's not at all any women participation in politics. So this all demonstrate the no change in behavior and attitude of the Taliban. And the third component, which I elaborate, is the last one and the most important one, which I think the West should be concerned about it a lot, is their close ties with the transitional terrorist group. I did mention I follow security issues in the region of Afghanistan, and based on the dots that I connected throughout there, that there's all transitional terrorist groups, they have further organized themselves and developed their allies within the country in Afghanistan under the Taliban. They were there before the Taliban, no doubt. There were 200 terrorist groups in Afghanistan, at least according to some reports that I read before the Taliban, but they were not really well organized. But now under the Taliban, who actually they promised in the Doha agreement that they will close and cut ties with the Al-Qaeda that they clearly identified, and they will not let the country to turn into a safe haven to be a threat to the West the US and the West, overall Western countries. I think that also proved to be wrong. The last strike, U.S. strike, the Zawahiri killing was a proof that they had and they have their close ties with the transitional terrorist group. I'm so sorry if I cross the time. I stopped there.
Oh, that's very, very great contribution at the beginning to set the scene, because as we branch out into a regional prism, I think it's good to get that domestic perspective first, at least your analysis and your wonderful research in this area, Niloufar. Maybe I can cross the border into Pakistan, and Dr. Neha Ansari, with your help, let's unpack some of that conversation. Since the US withdrawal, it seems that the differences have sharpened between Pakistan and at least elements of the Taliban, if not all of the Taliban. We've seen the cross-border attacks. We've seen reportedly Taliban and Pakistani border troops engaging in fighting. There's also unconfirmed reports, and I should say it's unconfirmed mainly because we don't have a very big media scene at the moment in Afghanistan, of Pakistani drones apparently flying over certain cities, including in the province of Khost, that I've been looking at some of the reports, unconfirmed again. There is this view that, Pakistan, Imran Khan famously said at the beginning, as the Taliban came to power, that the Afghans had broken the shackles of slavery. I was absolutely mesmerized by the speech by then Interior Minister of Pakistan, Sheikh Rashid Ahmed, at border crossing near Torkham, and he literally taunted India for 45 minutes in that speech, celebrating effectively a Taliban return to power. But is this a far cry where we are today from General Faiz Hamid's a very flamboyant visit to Serena Hotel in Kabul a few days after Taliban came to power? How does all of this make sense, to you, looking at Pakistan from the Pakistani perspective, and just enlighten us, Neha?
Thank you. Sorry, I was unmuting myself. As you pointed out earlier, that is this a case of buyer's remorse? I wouldn't. I don't know if it's. I think it's slightly premature to say that right now, but it has not been to Pakistan's expectations, to say the least. We can see, even especially you talked about General Faiz, and we see that he has been reposted. He is not the Corps Commander Peshawar anymore, and is not leading the negotiations. We assume there are several streams of negotiations that are currently taking place with the Pakistani Taliban, between the Pakistani Taliban and Pakistan. And one stream was being led by General Faiz as the Corps Commander of Peshawar, and he has been moved to Bahawalpur, which is really not supposed to be a very significant post. So we see that we can surmise from that things are not how Pakistan was expecting them to be, and we also see that it appears there is some disagreement even within the Pakistani military as to how to go about it. There are reports that Pakistan's Army Chief, General Qamar Bajwa, was not entirely pleased with a complete Taliban takeover. He did want a more broad-based, more inclusive government, and did not just want a Taliban-only center of power in Kabul. But as you know, that General Faiz and other members were more embracing of the Taliban, and assumed that they could use the Taliban to essentially disarm the Pakistani Taliban, or known as the TTP, and also convince them to join the mainstream, to recognize the Pakistani constitution, and become part of mainstream politics, etc. And essentially under the guise of democracy, just govern, or find a way to govern. However, we see that that's not coming to plan. There were a few things that the Pakistani establishment wanted, or Pakistan wanted the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban to do. They wanted essentially, yes, as I said, bring the TTP on board and want a solution to that. That is pretty much not happening. The Afghan Taliban initially had, appeared to be not only mediators but guarantors, and they seem to be taking not a very proactive role in that anymore. We also see that Pakistan wanted a diminished influence of India in Afghanistan, and that has not happened. Instead, we see India actively engaging with the Taliban. India is providing vital food aid, and there's, and we see a lot of diplomatic engagement there. The Taliban defense minister even suggested military training in India, as was reported. And then the third aspect is that they also wanted, Pakistan also wanted the Taliban to recognize the Jiran line as an international border, and that has not happened. So a lot has not been under the expectations of what Pakistan wanted from the Taliban, and they realize that they don't have enough leverage as they thought they would. We always knew that it's not. In some reports, it was shown that essentially the Afghan Taliban are puppets of Pakistan. Clearly, that's not the case. It's there's a lot. There's a major complex picture, and as you know, the Kandaharis do not entirely disagree with the Haqqanis. It's a very complex picture, and I think we all realize that there are a lot of stakeholders that need to be brought together, but their interests vary. So it's a pretty complicated picture, and I think Pakistan has itself in a bind.
Thank you very much for giving us that head start on perspectives centered around Pakistan and Afghanistan relations. Maybe I can also go to another neighbor for some reflections from the Iran perspective. Fatemeh Aman, we very much rely on your expertise to enlighten us on some of these Iranian-Taliban relationship aspects. Maybe we can kick us off on that with a question on, Iran's relationship with Afghanistan has been turbulent. We know the turbulence has always been there for the last 2 decades. Before that, the last time the Taliban were in power, the Iranian regime and the Taliban did not enjoy a good relationship. But things have moved on, it seems. Where does that relationship between the two countries stand today? And if I can also squeeze in some question there about the Iranian interest in particular. We often hear what Iran's interests are. Now that the United States has departed and its allies have left the country, Afghanistan, how have those fundamental interests shifted? And is Iran value for money out of the Taliban?
Open my mic. I also want to thank you guys for having me on this great, amazing, and timely panel with distinguished guests. To answer your question, a very brief answer is you don't want to be in Iran's shoes at this point, right now, because as you mentioned, I mean, the clashes and disputes have been going on for decades, even before the fall of the Taliban in 2001. But this time, things are more complicated since there is confusion. They really don't know how to react and how they should have managed the relationship with the Taliban. In the beginning, when the Taliban surprisingly, in a manner, came to power, they tried to be as friendly as possible toward the new regime. They called the Taliban, freedom fighters and a neighbor in the, kind neighbors. And they talk of the need to build a lasting relationship with the Taliban, with the new regime in Afghanistan. Then they faced the outcry inside Iran. There was a broad sympathy toward what it was considered and conceived as national resistance. Many people who covered, reporters, journalists who covered Ahmad Shah Massoud, late Ahmad Shah Massoud, just traveled to Afghanistan to pledge support for Ahmad Massoud and for the resistance inside Afghanistan. So with the government, you will see, with the Iranian government, you will hear conflicting messages. On one side, their main concern, the main issue is really security of the eastern borders between Iran and Afghanistan. They don't want to irritate the Taliban, but at the same time, they don't want to be viewed as too friendly toward the rulers in Kabul. So there is still a mistrust going on between Iran and and the Taliban regime with the, and as I mentioned, you will hear conflicting messages and statements from Iran. So just very recently, Kazemi Qomi, he is the president's representative to on Afghanistan's affair, called the Resistance Front or something, a hoax, a fake, something that was built by the Western powers. And he accused the United States of transferring now the ISK fighters from Syria and Yemen into Afghanistan, and trying to inflict a war between Iran and Afghanistan. So a statement that he took back later, and also former Iran ambassador to Afghanistan just today, he said, no, it's not a hoax. There is in fact a resistance going on, and implied that Iran should be supporting them. So that shows the importance and the concerns they have over, over a possible civil war in Afghanistan and the ISK fighters. They have been focusing and putting all their resources into this, into this issue. But there is also the problem that right now, lack of funding, basically keeps them from securing the borders as much as they really find desirable. So if we come to the border clashes, I could explain why they are so worried, and how that border clashes, is impacting everything else about Afghanistan and Iran relations, and how it would really influence other issues that's going on between the two countries.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that initial remarks. I'm going to come to you now, Dr. Shubha Prasad, for perspectives on, we heard a mention of India every time we talk about Pakistan relations with Afghanistan. I think one of the key challenges, and this is something that I've also seen through academic work, is that I think there is quite an understatement, maybe an underappreciation in Afghanistan, perhaps, of the significance of the Pakistan-India challenges in the relationship, and how in many ways, Afghanistan has often played as a proxy ground for that sort of contestation. We saw an Indian delegation visit Kabul recently, meeting with the Taliban regime's Ministry of Foreign Affairs people. There was, I think, cooperation around the vaccines before that had been put in place before. There's something around humanitarian affairs and wheat, I think, that India promised to give Afghanistan. India, for whatever reason, is seen as kind of a good, regional neighbor. It's not an immediate neighbor. It's seen as a good neighbor in Afghanistan in perception. Maybe it's Bollywood, we don't know. But there is definitely something there that, for people like me, it's often a concern. How do we understand India now? Is India capable, willing, and focused enough to have a relationship with the Taliban, and with a view that it doesn't play that proxy war with Pakistan again? So I have a lot of questions. Maybe I'm not able to articulate very clearly, but maybe we can start off by checking with you, what are India's top concerns and interests in Afghanistan? And to address these, what channels of communication exist between the Taliban and the Indian government?
So I think to understand India's pivot from first boycotting the Taliban to now reaching out to the Taliban last year, we need to also look at India's position in the region this time last year. If we look at a broader perspective, India over the last decade has increasingly found itself isolated in its own region. South Asia, which I think is a neighborhood that historically India has taken for granted, now sees itself in a region where the Chinese presence in its neighboring states has become increasingly strong, and in fact, in many instances has displaced India's influence. If you look at Nepal, for instance, or you look at Sri Lanka, for instance. And I think 2020 saw a turning point where the border conflict with China actually flared up, and till today remains unresolved. And what India saw was also a loss of territory to China. So it's interesting that you point out that potentially Afghanistan historically has been a ground for proxy war with Pakistan, but I think increasingly going forward, Indian concerns with Afghanistan are actually more related to their concerns with China. And I think this is actually where India's strategic focus is as of today. So when we see this time last year, the Taliban take over in Afghanistan, I think India was genuinely worried about losing another foothold in South Asia. And there were all these concerns in Indian policy circles and the policy elite that India needed to do something to reassert its presence in that region. And so I think given this context, that there are three, I think, major concerns that India has as of right now when it comes to Afghanistan. And I think this explains this reaching out or these overtures to the Taliban over the past year. One of which is definitely that the US withdrawal has created this vacuum that China can now fill. And I think that is of high concern. All these conversations and talks about potentially adding Afghanistan to the CPEC corridor raised alarm bells in New Delhi. So which is why you've seen more recently, including the foreign minister of India, mention that, oh, of course, we would love to connect Afghanistan to the Arabian Sea via the Chabahar port in Iran, and talks about expanding trade and access to Central Asia via Afghanistan. So this is definitely ways in which India is actually thinking about how China's influence in the region is going to play out and how India can counter that in its own ways. Second, and this is the more conventional answer that I think you were hinting at as we began, is that India is also concerned that Afghanistan will become a safe haven for more terrorist attacks against India. And I think this is the primary reassurance that the Indian government has sought from the Taliban when it comes to diplomatic talks, that they will not basically harbor terrorist spaces for attacks against India, and they're hoping to use this leveraging against Pakistan. And finally, I think for India, if you look at the past 20 years, they've invested more than $3 billion in infrastructure and development projects. And I think this is something that the Indian government is very concerned about, because it is a sunk cost, and they don't want to actually give up on all the goodwill they've built with the people of Afghanistan because of all of this investment that they put in. So I think in terms of the Ministry of External Affairs in India, I think their long-term strategy is that building this soft power and goodwill with the people of Afghanistan will pay dividends regardless of the regime in power. So I think India really genuinely wants to foster that people-to-people relationship, because it thinks in the long run, this is actually what's going to serve its strategic interests, particularly vis-a-vis China. Because if we were to ask the question of whether now it's actually not about a proxy war between India and Pakistan in Afghanistan, but India's concerns with China, an open battleground isn't possible. India just does not have the resources for that. So it is this soft power that is trying to build within Afghanistan that I think is important. So on the Indian end, I think there are very good reasons for reaching out to the Taliban and wanting to continue building a relationship with the people of Afghanistan. And having said that, though, I do want to emphasize that it takes two to tango. And I think all of these overtures that India has made over the past year have been reciprocated, and the Taliban has been genuinely reaching out to India as well. And if you want to look from their perspective, I think building this relationship with India is lending the regime some international legitimacy that it's seeking from non-conventional sectors, particularly in the South Asian region. Secondly, I think India's development projects are going to help the domestic economy. And I think it will also help garner some domestic support for the regime potentially. And finally, I think Taliban, speaking to Neha's point earlier, can hedge its bets against Pakistan by increasing its cooperation and relationship with India as well, if you think about the boundary dispute as well. So I think there are very good reasons on both sides for cooperation. But now, as the question that comes out with this is India willing to use this leverage it now has to actually think about very important and serious issues that were raised and we've been talking about in terms of saying access to education for women, or policies that will actually lead to more democratic institutions. Because if India is willing to fund projects in the education sector, these are concessions that India could feasibly negotiate, right? So I think it's in the coming months, I think it'll be interesting to see whether India chooses to go down that path or not.
That's a very great analysis. Thank you so much for setting out the key aspects of the Indian perspective on this issue. I think for the sort of remainder half of this, or just under half of this event, I'd like to focus a bit more about connecting the region with the kind of international Western perspective, and that'd be my challenge to have the opportunity to do that while I have these wonderful experts on the panel. I'll come back to you, Niloufar. We've spoken about the state of play very much, how things look at the moment. And now the key difficult question is, we often see in Afghanistan that the problems are, diagnosed fairly well. The problem, like anywhere else in the world, is when, address these issues. So going forward, what do you think, first of all, is the implication of, or a series of implications of the US drone strike that killed Ayman al-Zawahiri at the last day of July? In the heart of Kabul, for those of us who know, Shirpur is literally, used to be the diplomatic quarters, very central in the city. And the implications both in terms of, the conversations that have been happening in various places, including in Doha, to get some sort of track going between the US and the Taliban, and the Biden administration, based on some reports, have just announced that they're not going to release the 3.5 billion, the half of the frozen reserves to the Afghan central bank, because they can't guarantee that this won't end up in terrorist hands. So there are these very quick evolving issues as well. And how do you see all of this kind of contestation with the West and the implications of this strike vis-a-vis the regional kind of, action on the regional side? How are the Taliban managing all of this? Are they even able to manage it?
Well, last 1 year has been, I think, one of the areas that Taliban tried to play very well was the engagement with the international community and the West and the regional countries. And there has been an extensive diplomatic relationship between the Taliban, the Central Asian countries, South Asian countries, and of course, Iran as well. There were all kinds of coordination and cooperation on humanitarian assistance to help the people of Afghanistan from the region and from the West. And the focus was that, actually. The focus has been the addressing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But all that, no country in the region and in the world has recognized the Taliban yet, because of the concerns that the region of course, have with the uncertainty about the Taliban's future, their incapability of governing the borders and governing the country, addressing the grievances of the larger population, including minorities, and of course their treatment of women and their ties with the terrorist group. So there are factors that the world has been reluctant in recognizing the Taliban. And after the Zawahiri strike, I think that has the Taliban set a stage to further confirm those issues. And there are perceptions now that well, Taliban cannot be trusted, and there are the country can easily turn into safe haven for the terrorists. So all these issues that the regional countries have shown their concerns initially, because that the security could impact their borders, could impact their national interest. So they have been reluctant, and they will be reluctant. So implications, of course, we have seen a very quick response from the United States, but I don't see that the similar kind of responses, very direct responses from the region at this point. The region will engage with the Taliban, will continue its engagement with the Taliban, because, well, it seems they don't have any option. Of course, because there are two major crises that the regional countries, all of them, the Central Asia, South Asia, Iran, and even beyond that, are facing. One is insecurity, the second is refugee crisis. That clearly impacts all of them. Therefore, they want to have a closer relationship with Taliban in order to contend those threats that they will have under the Taliban regime. So I would see more relationships of these countries, including especially on the humanitarian aspects. Uzbekistan has played a very, very well role at this time, and in coordinating the humanitarian assistance. And I think the similar other countries will also play their role. The implications of strike would be, I think there would be a pause in the relationship between the diplomatic relationship between the US and the Taliban for a short time. I would see, not really for a long time. It could be a short stand at this point. And what I heard recently, that there are some talks with the World Bank on those reserve funds. So I don't know how that is the facts about those talks, whether that money will be released through the World Bank and through different channels and pattern of operation and mechanisms. But I think the winter is coming, and people are suffering, will suffer a lot. Therefore, the US will engage with Afghanistan to address those crises. Not particularly with the Taliban maybe at this point, because the money, I mean, whatever assistance will be given, they will be very careful that the money will not reach the Taliban at this point, especially after this Zawahiri strike, US strike against Zawahiri. But overall, I think there will be an engagement with the Afghanistan going forward because of the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding.
Thank you very much, Niloufar. Neha, I'm going to come back to you. We heard from Shubha about the sort of the new chapter in contestation, let's say proxy contestations, and perhaps India eyeing China as the new rival in town in Afghanistan. But we also know that based on the data and research that is out there, that Chinese interest in Afghanistan cannot unfold without the help of Pakistan, and that China has very much viewed Afghanistan, especially in the last 2 decades, through a Pakistani prism. The all-weather friends that China and Pakistan consider themselves to be is something that cannot be ignored. So first of all, how would this tangible proof, if we can say that, of Taliban hosting, or at least elements of the Taliban hosting quietly rather, Ayman al-Zawahiri in the heart of Kabul, will change some of that risk-averse Chinese uncertainty on the Taliban. And also, the other kind of, if I can top that up with a second question for you, there's also a view that the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is not really paying off in the way that it was, it was considered a few years ago even. That the public in Pakistan is impatient with, dividends from these kinds of relationship with China. So how will that play, towards, kind of the Chinese changing from South Asia more towards sort of Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, and all of those pressing challenges they have with the US and the world. So will we then end up again, Pakistan and India, with Pakistan and India, sort of we kind of playing the same tunes again in Afghanistan?
Thank you. So yes, very, very important questions. And to start with the first, with the Zawahiri strike, I think there were two aspects to that. One, that the United States still has its eyes, quote unquote, on the region, because I think this was for the last year, apart from the drone strike that hit that killed 10 civilians, including 7 children, we had not seen an active combat drone strike from the United States, and we see, and we saw that Zawahiri and other Al-Qaeda commanders had become more comfortable, and therefore were communicating more, and essentially had just become more comfortable with the fact that America had withdrawn, and we saw that the strike sort of also, I would say, reinstates a sort of deterrence that no, we've left, but we're still around. We can still conduct a precise discriminate strike and kill our enemies, even though we're not there. So it does reinstate a sort of American quote unquote presence. However, I would think that would obviously, China, I think, assumed that. I don't think that surprised China. I don't think anything surprises China, but I don't think that particularly surprised China. But it also, I think, would allow China to maybe really put pressure on the Taliban to make sure they don't harbor Uyghur militants, because that is China's bigger concern. Because there are, as Nilofer pointed out, over 200 transnational terrorist organizations there, and if reports are correct that they have organized themselves, they have become more confident, more open about organizing and recruiting, then we know that the Uyghur militancy is something that China has its eye on, particularly that we know the reports of Uyghur militants also cooperating with Baloch separatist militants in Pakistan, and there have been a recent uptick in attacks targeting Chinese engineers, Chinese citizens and officials in Pakistan. So that aspect of it, I think, would maybe get China more interested. I mean, China was always interested, but maybe more interested on the security front as well. And so on CPEC, you're right. It is not something that is, it is essentially, people have finally realized that CPEC was, or China's investment is not, is more a debt trap. There is analysis in Pakistan about that, but I think there is an equal kind of state-sponsored narrative that is very pro-China, and that is saying that no, we just need more time. The economic situation is because of the current politicians we have, not China. So that's the two narratives at play and there's a contestation of narratives there regarding China's investment. But people can see Chinese investments into nowhere. Sri Lanka's example is one of them. Not just them taking over the a port like sovereignty, but also that it did not help Sri Lanka when it needed it the most. But again, China has always, whenever we think China is going to step away or be aloof, it has always stepped up for Pakistan. Recently, it bailed Pakistan out again when it needed, when Pakistan was having severe, we assumed Pakistan would default again. We assumed that Pakistan would default, but China stepped up and bailed Pakistan out again. So, and Saudi Arabia helped too. So the idea is that regional actors end up helping Pakistan out, and Pakistan knows it can bank on them. So even though there are independent analyses out there warning that Chinese investment is not what it appears to be, I think the Pakistan has made its bets a long time ago, especially with US withdrawal, and it's going to stand very firmly behind and for China.
Thank you so much. That's very important points you raise, and thank you for tackling that CPEC question as well for us and for our listeners. Fatemeh, if I can come back to you, there was an argument a few years in the making in Afghanistan that, ironically, there was a point of convergence in early 2000s between the US and Western interest and that of Iran in Afghanistan. We also saw, for example, that in the sanctions and the JCPOA debate, conversations and others, that the Afghan transit routes, the Chabahar and all of that was excluded. And, there's definitely some truth to Iran and the West converging in Afghanistan in terms of their interests. As the situation evolves in Afghanistan, we heard about the problems, especially that Shia Afghans are facing in Afghanistan. We know that the Taliban ideologically are anti-Shia, not least because of the madrasa education they've been given, if not inside Pakistan, but certainly the curriculum is designed by the Deobandi madrasa system in Pakistan. Incredibly anti-Shia in many ways. So one could only imagine how much anxiety there must be amongst the Iranian establishment that had fostered relationship within Afghanistan, cultural relationship. We saw in Muharram, for example, the Taliban were very much going out of their way to show they're not anti-Shia, so they allowed for the black flags of Al-Hussein to go up in the various bits of Kabul and other cities. And we know that some of these activities have in the past been promoted, if not funded, by the Iranian embassy in Kabul. These things cost money. And so there is certainly that kind of relationship still ongoing. With this very long prelude, what I'm getting at is, if we're going forward with a situation where Iran is concerned about the lack of inclusivity within the Taliban's structures, of the Tajiks, of the Shias in particular, of the Hazara communities, and when the West is talking about lack of inclusivity, there seems to be a convergence. So do you at any point think that there would be a possibility that Afghanistan becomes relevant to the conversations between Iran and the US, or Iran and the European Union on migration issues and other issues? How can we understand that convergence, if there is any? And if there isn't, do you think there would be one?
Yes, you said it beautifully. There is, in fact, joint interest from both the United States, European, and Iran. Iran is the main route of drug trafficking from Afghanistan. It's Iran. I mean, the addiction is #1 social issue in Iran, and all these countries that we just mentioned, have an interest in fighting insurgency or expanding these extremist groups. There are, in fact, convergence of interests between all these players that we just mentioned. And Chabahar is, I think, the exclusion of Chabahar from the sanctions was also partly to combat expansion of China in that region, since they, signaled that they would finish the project if India would not continue doing so. Remember that in 2015, when JCPOA, because of the talks with the JCPOA, it really accelerated the project, and it would definitely benefit Afghanistan and Afghan people. Unfortunately, it had to stop, and there was no one who would invest in that region, which ultimately everybody was, it harmed everyone. But let me to the, what Iran could do at this time with the Taliban regime. Remember when I said there is really lack of helplessness somehow. They don't have many leverages over the Afghan, too much leverage over the Taliban. There was a time that they could use the deportation of millions of Afghans to blackmail Afghanistan government before the Taliban. I don't think Taliban would care about millions of Afghans returning home, so they are very cautious, the Iranians. They are, there is a sense of mistrust and extreme cautiousness, I would describe. They are very worried, and I think genuine concern is that the United States, if there is any intention to enter a war and confrontation, heavy confrontation with Iran, they would use eastern borders, not just the United States, for Arab rivals, any other player in the region. They believe they are vulnerable from their eastern border. And I think that is the point where all these regional players and really Western countries can cooperate. I mean, cooperation, it sounds kind of silly now with the 20 years of time to cooperate and do things, but now you expect, now that the Taliban is to power, that they would start cooperating. But there is really vital at this point, if we don't want Afghanistan to enroll in a irreversible, heavy harm of civil war. I mean, that is the point where United States can also show its good intention, fighting drug trafficking. I think there are many missed opportunities between both countries. And yes, Iran, as you mentioned, cooperated heavily, as Ambassador Dobbins has said numerous times. They have provided intelligence to the United States and they facilitated the fall of Taliban back then. And now, right now, there is a mistrust, obviously. And but I think Afghanistan would be a good place to start, just to help Afghans and prevent the region to enroll in more chaos than it is right now. I hope I answered your question. I think I was just looking at the time. I didn't
that's great. We'll come lastly, so maybe we can do another round of final thoughts. But before that, I'd like to go back to Dr. Shubha Prasad. Shubha, maybe we can start wrapping up this conversation slowly. As much as I'm enjoying this and getting really educated by these incredible insights, how worried do you think we should be by what is happening under Prime Minister Modi's government in India vis-a-vis the Muslim debate, the minorities in general? And I say this because I do see in Taliban online activity a major interest in what happens to Muslims, let's say, whether presumed, actual, that's not my place. But there's certainly a lot of concern about the relationship that is there, how kind of almost a Hindutva style, rule of government in India is turning into a Hindu nationalist country. And how would these things harm that wider soft power kind of ambitions that you mentioned at the beginning? And is this partly the reason, do you think, that we also, at least we don't see the evidence of a lot of Western and Indian engagement on Afghanistan, whereas there was some in the past. I know, of course, the country's not fallen to the Taliban, it's a different scenario. But maybe if you can comment on those in a couple of minutes, and then we'll go to some concluding thoughts.
Absolutely. No, I think these are very critical questions that you're posing. And I think I should be explicit and say, I don't think it's an almost Hindutva style government. It is a government that espouses the values of Hindutva. It is a Hindu right-wing government. And I think it has made explicitly clear in its policies, particularly its citizenship policies, that it is championing the cause of majoritarian politics. However, it so envisions what a Hindu nation means. And I think you're absolutely correct in pointing out that increasingly, or especially since 2014, since this particular government has taken power, we have seen Muslim minorities in India increasingly feel repressed and suppressed and have faced persecution of a nature that they felt they did not feel in the past. And I think that is incredibly important to take note of. And I think if you saw recently, certain remarks made by members of the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, led to a diplomatic furor in West Asia, where countries took offense with what was said in what was completely a domestic political setting, where a Hindu right-wing rhetoric was used to vilify Muslim minorities. And I think increasingly what this particular government in India has to realize is that what is said domestically to win votes and support is being listened to internationally, and increasingly with social media, this exchange is becoming very quick and very immediate. And so I think the repercussions for foreign policy are strong, and I think it's something India really needs to think about, but especially this particular government needs to think about, because India cannot afford to lose its long-standing relationship with West Asia in general and Afghanistan now in particular, as for the reasons I outlined previously. So if, as you're saying, Taliban's paying close attention to how different countries treat Muslim minorities within their polity, then I think this is something that may come up as a tripping stone in the future and something to keep an eye out for. But secondly, I think just to conclude from an Indian perspective on foreign policy for the region, this present Hindutva government, as I will call them that, is interestingly not very different from prior governments when it comes to the issues it takes seriously in foreign policy. And I think one of the reasons is that the Indian External Affairs Minister is a career diplomat. He has been socialized in a setting of foreign policy of prior governments as well. And though he might create a rhetoric and a narrative which is based largely on Hindu philosophy or Hindu epics, or chooses to distance himself explicitly in the language of non-alignment, from non-alignment, most of Indian foreign policy for this region has been very much about strategic autonomy, which lies at the heart of the core of India's foreign policy since independence, which is non-alignment. So I think going forward, when it comes to foreign policy for the region, I actually think it'll be a lot of strategic calculations in terms of what is in India's best interests. And I do not think that religion plays a role in that as much, but I think what will be a problem is the ways in which this government plays religion in its political cards domestically and how that affects its international policies.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we are coming to the last 5 minutes, and I'm going to be requesting everyone to kindly keep your remarks short so we can close the session on time. Niloufar, we didn't get the opportunity to unpack much about the Central Asian component, and the Afghanistan Central Asian neighbors are still quite relevant, and you mentioned Uzbekistan by name. How do you examine the role of Central Asia, in particular of Uzbekistan, going forward vis-a-vis South Asia neighbors and Iran, and also amongst these neighbors, who do you think holds the most leverage against the Taliban, if any? And then I'll move to the other speakers for last comments.
Well, that's okay. Central Asia is a brief answer, but your question poses a lot of smaller questions, subset of questions to the region. Well, with the U.S. withdrawal, there has been changes in the region in terms of alignment and realignment, hedging of smaller power with the big powers. And as mentioned earlier, China and Russia are playing major role, one politically, other economically. China is getting more involved into Central Asian countries, as well as in Afghanistan, though we haven't seen any concrete results since this engagement of China with Afghanistan. But overall, since your question is related to Central Asian countries, I think Central Asian countries face tremendous security threats. As I mentioned earlier, as Islamic State operatives turn these areas into battleground for jihadism. There's a Jamaat Ansari, which is getting very active in the northern region of Afghanistan, and the smaller groups also linked with ISIS and Al Qaeda are taking shape, which have a closer link with the Uzbekistan, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So these smaller groups are taking shape and organizing, especially in the northern areas of Afghanistan, which are threatening and problematic and challenging for the Central Asia countries, especially Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. With that said, they have extended closer cooperation and coordination with Afghanistan and with the Taliban since the Taliban takeover. Uzbekistan almost kind of becoming a hub for all these events on Afghanistan, and both diplomatic events on Afghanistan and also events on humanitarian assistance and coordination. And I think that has been very prominent. Uzbekistan role has been extremely prominent. And I think that's going to continue going forward as well. They had very close relationship with, because there's one Uzbek ethnic group also in the Taliban leadership composition. So I think with that also it plays a role. So there has been close relationship with of the Taliban with Uzbekistan because of that factor as well. I think that's going to continue. And I would I would see that Uzbekistan will become a hub for a humanitarian assistance coming from the region and from beyond as well. In terms of Tajikistan, Tajikistan is, of course, having closer tie as well, but there has been some tensions between Tajikistan and the Taliban because of the border crisis. There were some issues related to tracks, transit, and related to the Tajik tracks, which was stopped by the Taliban at some point. So there was some border tension between them that is going to continue based on the fact that there are the Jamaat Ansari and other smaller terrorist, Tajik terrorist groups are organizing in the northern areas. But well, as I said, there is no choice. They are close neighbors, and they have to have this policy of engagement rather than disengagement. That's not going to help them, policy of disengagement. In terms of Iran, I think Ms. Aman already mentioned that. Iran is standing in a very complicated situation, and I think would be problematic at this time to cement its policy around engagement as disengagement with the Taliban, but to contain the crisis, to contain and do not let any escalation happen between the Taliban and Tehran. I think they're going to continue this kind of diplomatic relationship with Tehran, and for the economic purpose that especially Iran has as well, and also to contain and prevent this security and refugee crisis that they are facing. But at this point, as mentioned earlier by other colleagues, cementing policy of engagement and disengagement and a concrete policy with the current regime in power is problematic and challenging from foreign policy perspective to all these regional countries.
Thank you very much. Neha, very briefly to you, do you think that the Pakistani establishment, security establishment, the ulama, the madrasa networks, all combined, do you think it's accurate to say that Pakistan still holds a significant leverage over a large number of the Taliban leaders, if not the entire leadership?
It's difficult to quantify it. It's very difficult because it's changing. It's changing more rapidly than I expected. Going in last year, I, among other South Asian watchers, were convinced that Pakistan has a lot of leverage. But over time, we see that that hasn't been the case. And like anything else, Taliban are not a monolith. They are different sections of the Taliban that have also competing interests, and so have are adhering to other players. And that is something we need to keep an eye out for. Pakistan obviously has gambled and invested so much over the last 20 years in making sure the Taliban come to power, that it's obviously never going to walk away from that. And it's obviously going to continue to try and build that relationship as much as possible. But there are obviously things for the Pakistani establishment that are going to be no-goes, like giving a very important protocol and to the TTP chief. There have been reports when Asfandia Amir has talked about how Noor Wali, who is the TTP chief, is almost treated like a minister in Afghanistan, which is something, if that's true, that is alarming, and that is something not Pakistan had signed up for. So it's things like that that I think Pakistan will be keeping an eye out for. And it's just overall, even regionally, very complex situation, because we see that the big three, as I like to call them, Russia, China, and India, have complicated relationships among each other. We know India has really close defense ties with Russia, when it's competing with China. But China is also, is trying to make sure there's influence without stepping on, but also, again, sorry, it's I try to keep it brief, but the idea is that it is a very complex situation and everybody is treading very carefully. And but as Nilüfer said, everyone's going to keep engaging as carefully as possible, and Pakistan's going to continue to do that. But Pakistan has to rethink a lot of its mechanisms on how it moves forward.
Okay, great. Shubha, I'm going to give you I'm going to press you to be very brief. Who do you think, from where your research and expertise are situated, holds the most leverage among the neighbors or in the region on the Taliban?
So I actually think I'm going to reframe your question and say, what is it that regional actors and those with strategic interests in Afghanistan can leverage? And I think that comes down to understanding right now, what is it that the Taliban wants? So aside from leverage in terms of coercion, how can you leverage what Taliban wants right now? And I think there are two things that Taliban wants. One is this semblance of normalcy in the domestic sphere, and this idea that there is stability and law and order, and that they actually have control within Afghanistan. Second is this idea that they are seeking international recognition for the regime, and they want more legitimacy for the regime by expanding their diplomatic relationships with different states, and particularly within the region. So I think if actors in the region are keeping an eye on this, this is what they can leverage to see how much Taliban is willing to engage with them, and on the terms of getting these two goals.
Wonderful. The last word goes to you, Fatima. You talked about the lack of ideas that are currently in Iran, the challenges of what to do with this Taliban situation in Tehran. But do you think we are moving towards a situation where obviously Iran wants the JCPOA situation resolved? Do you think Afghanistan will be brought in as a point of leverage in that conversation with the West, or at least a point of engagement with the West? You're on mute, sorry.
Yes, it definitely will come up in their discussions with the West. But the issue is that reality is that right now, Taliban has more leverage over Iran than the reverse. The water dispute is going to be, they are not going to be, they don't want to be responsible for the consequences. There is the border clashes, and there is trafficking, all of the, or religious minorities, for instance. I think all these are the leverages, the issues that the Taliban can press Iran, can put pressure on Iran. Iran, on the other hand, except the security of or recognition of the Taliban, doesn't have much at this point. The problem is all these unknowns about the Taliban regime. In the beginning, they thought they have their own influence within the group. They invited delegation after the delegation of the Taliban to Tehran, but they know that they cannot compete with China, they cannot compete with Pakistan, with Qatar, with other players in terms of having more influence within the group. So I think at this point, China, I see more leverage, has more leverage because of the trillion-dollar, industries that could definitely benefit Iran, Afghanistan, and the region. For that, they need obviously security, but that is I think at this point, this is more than the dominant factors that could move the Taliban, except the recognition of the regime by, at least the regional players.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niloufar Sakhi, Fatemeh Aman, Dr. Shubha Prasad, Dr. Neha Ansari. We've been honored and delighted to host you for this wonderful conversation, if at the same time, quite a challenging one as we look back at 1 year of the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan, in what seems to be one of the world's most heartbreaking humanitarian catastrophes unfolding. Women are not allowed to go to school, seek education, as probably one of the only countries on the planet. So with that background, it's very difficult for me to conclude what has been discussed, but what is clear is that we need this regional expertise, we need this regional prism to make sense of Afghanistan's issues, to move forward on engagement internationally, but also that the kind of exhaustion that we feel in the West vis-a-vis Afghanistan and what to do is not necessarily a unique case to the Western policymakers. It seems that the regional players have similar challenges, with the difference that geographically they have no choice but to engage with the Taliban. And as we go forward, perhaps one of the key things that we can look forward to or keep an eye on is whether or not the Taliban are able to transform from an insurgency to something that looks like a political party, if not a fully functional government. Maybe with those parting thoughts, we ended here. Thank you so much. I would like to also thank Misha Iqbal, my colleague in the background, and Haris Samad, without whose help we would not have been able to hold this conversation today. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again.